world where birth determines destiny, one king dared to see beyond bloodlines. While nobles paraded their beautiful daughters before the throne, desperate for royal favor, he saw through their rehearsed smiles and practiced curtsies to the emptiness beneath. What he sought couldn't be found in silken gowns or ancestral titles, but in the shadows, where truth had always lived. She was nothing, an orphan, a servant girl with calloused hands and downcast eyes. For 17 years, she had been invisible, a ghost moving through a world that never bothered to see her, until the moment that changed everything, when the most powerful man in the realm looked past the glittering nobility and saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. What happens when a king's gaze falls where it should never wander? When ancient traditions clash with an unexpected connection that threatens to tear a kingdom apart. As whispers of witchcraft spread and powerful enemies emerge from the shadows, one question remains. Why would a king risk his crown, his kingdom, and his life for a girl from nowhere? The stone walls of the great hall seemed to sweat with anticipation, droplets of moisture catching the light of 1,000 candles. Ellen watched from the shadows as noble daughters paraded before the king, their silk dresses whispering promises their mouths dared not speak. She felt the weight of her own coarse dress against her skin, a constant reminder of her place. But something was wrong. The king's eyes, usually polite and distant during these matchmaking feasts, had turned cold. His fingers tightened around the golden goblet until his knuckles blanched white, and when he finally stood, the hall fell into a silence that crushed the air from Ellen's lungs. The unnatural stillness made her heart stutter. A servant boy dropped a platter somewhere in the distance, the clatter swallowed by the thick tension. Lady Ravenswood, Ellen's mistress, dug her nails into her own daughter's wrist, drawing tiny crescents of blood that the girl dared not acknowledge. The family had spent their last silver on tonight's appearance, their desperation a scent more pungent than the roasted meats growing cold on forgotten platters. "I have seen enough." The king's voice cut through the hall, neither loud nor soft, but slicing like a newly honed blade. The crowd drew a collective breath, anticipation thickening in the air. Ellen pressed herself deeper into the shadow of a great oak column, willing herself to disappear. She had spent her 17 years practicing invisibility, a skill that had kept her from the worst of the Ravenswood's cruelty. Lord Blackthorn stepped forward, his jewel-encrusted doublet catching the light. "Your Majesty, perhaps my Elizabeth has not had the chance to..." Silence. The word fell like a headsman's axe. "I have watched for 3 nights as you parade your daughters before me, like prize mares at auction. You dress them in silks that strain your coffers, teach them songs they have no passion for, and instruct them to laugh at jests they do not understand." The king's eyes swept across the hall, and Ellen felt a terrible prickling at the back of her neck. Something was terribly amiss. This was not how such gatherings ended. The nobles exchanged glances, confusion wrinkling brows accustomed to displaying only practiced charm. "Your Majesty," ventured the Duchess of Holloway, her voice trembling despite her rank, "surely one of these fine young women has captured your interest? My Genevieve has been trained since birth to..." "To what?" The king's voice softened dangerously. "To bear children she will rarely see? To embroider scenes of hunts she will never join? To sit silently while men decide the fate of her lands?" Ellen felt her throat constrict. She had never heard a nobleman speak this way, let alone the king himself. The daughters of the nobility stood frozen, jeweled butterflies pinned by his words. The Ravenswood girl, Ellen's tormentor since childhood, looked suddenly small, her carefully arranged features crumpling like parchment in rain. "I seek a queen with a mind that questions," continued the king, moving away from his throne. "A heart that feels beyond the boundaries of court etiquette. Eyes that see what others overlook." His boots made no sound on the rush-strewn floor as he walked among the stunned nobility. "And yet you bring me only reflections, mirrors that show me nothing but my own power." Lady Ravenswood's face twisted into a grimace she tried to disguise as a smile. "Your Majesty jest with us," she tittered, voice high and strained. "Surely a king requires a queen of proper breeding and what is proper breeding, my lady?" The king stopped before her, close enough that she had to tilt her chin to meet his gaze. Is it bloodline so tangled that cousins marry cousins until madness blooms like winter roses? Is it the ability to recite one's ancestors 16 generations back while forgetting the names of servants who have tended your fires for 20 years? The hall fell silent once more. Even the minstrels had stopped playing, their fingers hovering over silent strings. Ellen pressed a hand to her mouth, tasting the dust and soap on her skin. The king was walking again, and horror gripped her heart as she realized he was moving toward her corner of the hall. She pressed back against the cold stone, praying to become one with the shadows. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the whispers that had begun to ripple through the crowd. The king's path was deliberate, his eyes scanning the edges of the room where servants and lesser folk were permitted to witness the grandeur from a safe distance. He stopped 3 paces from where she stood, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the single thread of silver among the chestnut of his closely trimmed beard, close enough to smell the faint scent of pine and leather that clung to him beneath the expected perfumes of royalty. You. His voice was softer now, but in the silence of the hall, it reached her like a physical touch. Step forward. Ellen's legs trembled beneath her simple dress. This was impossible. Kings did not address orphaned servants hidden in shadows. Her mind raced, certain he must be speaking to someone else, some noble daughter who had chosen an unusual strategy of modesty. She remained frozen, eyes downcast. The girl in gray, he clarified, with eyes the color of storm clouds, stepped forward. 100 heads turned, 100 pairs of eyes found her, standing in her faded dress, the rough wool suddenly feeling like a hair shirt against her skin. Her hands, red and chapped from morning's laundry, clasped each other so tightly that her knuckles ached. She managed a single step forward, her knees threatening to buckle. Your name? The king asked. Ellen, Your Majesty. Her voice emerged as little more than a whisper. She cursed herself for the weakness and tried again. Ellen of Nowhere in particular. A murmur rippled through the crowd, half amusement, half scandal at her directness. The king's mouth twitched, not in anger, but something that might have been the ghost of a smile. Ellen of Nowhere in particular, he repeated, and something in the way he said it transformed her humble introduction into a title of strange dignity. Would you do me the honor of sharing a dance? The hall erupted into gasps and exclamations. Lady Ravenswood surged forward, face mottled with rage and embarrassment. Your Majesty, she is but a servant, an orphan we charitably took in. Surely you cannot— The king silenced her with nothing more than a raised hand, his eyes never leaving Ellen's face. I believe I asked the lady a question. Ellen's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The world narrowed to this impossible moment. The king of all the realm asking her, a shadow, to dance before the assembled nobility. Humiliation and terror warred within her, alongside something else she dared not name. I do not know how to dance, Your Majesty, she admitted, her honesty hanging in the air between them like a challenge. The crowd held its breath. The king stepped closer, close enough that only she could hear his next words. Then perhaps you might teach me something instead. Before Ellen could respond, he took her hand, her work-roughened hand with its broken nails and calluses, and raised it to his lips. The kiss was brief, formal even, but it might as well have been a thunderbolt for the impact it had on the hall. Someone screamed. Lady Ravenswood swayed as though about to faint. The daughters of nobility stared in horror and fascination, their carefully constructed world cracking before their eyes. The silence that followed was absolute, crushing in its weight. Ellen stood transfixed, her hand still held in the king's, unable to breathe or think or move. In the space of a heartbeat, everything had changed, and in the depths of his eyes, she saw something that terrified her more than all the court's contempt. Interest, genuine interest. What could a king possibly see in her that no one else had ever bothered to look for? The kiss lingered like a brand on Ellen's skin long after the king had withdrawn. Her hand, the same hand that had scrubbed floors and wrung laundry since dawn, now trembled as though it belonged to someone else. The great hall had devolved into chaos, a storm of whispers and accusations that crashed against the stone walls. Noble women clutched their daughters, pulling them away as if Ellen's sudden visibility might be contagious. Lord Haverhill spilled his wine across the table, the red liquid seeping into white linen like blood from an invisible wound. "Witchcraft," hissed Lady Thornfield as she passed, her voice pitched just loud enough for Ellen to hear. "No king would look twice at a mouse like you without dark magic at play." Ellen's throat closed, a vice of fear tightening with each passing second. The air in the hall grew thick with hostility, pressing against her skin like a physical weight. She caught fragments of conversations, sharp-edged and dangerous. Disgrace to the crown, bewitched. Embarrassment to all proper ladies. The Ravenswood daughters stood in a tight cluster, their faces streaked with tears that carved pale channels through their carefully applied rouge. Their mother, face twisted in barely contained fury, gripped the sleeve of Duke Blackmore, her knuckles white against the deep blue velvet of his doublet. "I assure you," Lady Ravenswood's words carried across the chaotic hall, "we had no knowledge of her ambitions. A charity case, nothing more. Had we known she harbored such delusions?" The Duke's cold laugh cut her off. "Your household standing is precarious enough, Marissa. To bring such a creature into the king's presence." He left the threat unspoken, but Lady Ravenswood's face drained of color. Ellen pressed her back against the stone pillar, suddenly desperate for escape. The grand hall, with its soaring ceilings and glittering chandeliers, had transformed into a cage of hostile eyes. Her chest tightened with each shallow breath. The scent of beeswax and roasted meat now mingled with something sour, fear and anger permeating the air. A servant boy, Thomas from the kitchens, passed within inches and deliberately avoided her gaze. Already, she had become untouchable. The king had long since retired, escorted by his royal guard, leaving chaos in his wake. Without his presence, the court's facade of civility crumbled completely. When Lady Ravenswood finally seized Ellen's arm, her fingers dug deep enough to bruise. "Not a word," she hissed, her breath hot against Ellen's ear. "Not a single word until we return home." The journey back to Ravenswood Manor passed in suffocating silence. The carriage, usually filled with the daughters' excited chatter after court functions, remained tomb quiet. Only the occasional sob from the youngest Ravenswood daughter, Cecily, pierced the stillness. Ellen kept her eyes fixed on her hands, tracing the calluses and rough patches that marked her as different from the silk-soft women who shared her carriage. The phantom sensation of the king's lips against her skin would not fade, a memory her mind returned to despite her attempts to banish it. What had possessed him? What madness or cruelty had driven him to single her out, to transform her in an instant from invisible to infamous? Her heart clenched with a new fear, that this had been nothing more than a royal whim, a moment's amusement at the expense of both her and the noble families. If so, she alone would bear the consequences long after his fleeting interest faded. The manor house loomed dark against the night sky when they arrived, its windows blank and unwelcoming. Inside, Lady Ravenswood finally unleashed her rage. The slap came without warning, snapping Ellen's head to one side. Pain blossomed across her cheek, but she did not cry out. "You scheming little wretch!" Lady Ravenswood seethed, spittle flying from her lips. "Years we clothe you, feed you, raise you above the gutter where you belong. And this is how you repay our charity?" Ellen tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. "My lady, I did nothing. Nothing. You call humiliating my daughters before the entire court nothing?" Lady Ravenswood's voice rose to a shriek, making a spectacle, drawing attention like a common harlot. Lord Ravenswood appeared in the doorway of his study, eyes bloodshot from wine and humiliation. "Enough, Marissa, the servants will hear. Let them hear. Let everyone know what this cuckoo in our nest has done." She rounded on Ellen again, face contorted. "Whatever game you played tonight, whatever trap you laid, it ends now. Tomorrow you return to your duties, double them. The stables need mucking, the kitchen floors scrubbing. Perhaps hard labor will remind you of your station." Sleep eluded Ellen that night. Her small attic room, always cold, now seemed frozen in time. Moonlight spilled across her thin blanket, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air with each shuddering breath she took. Below, she could hear the continued arguments, Lord Ravenswood's deeper tones occasionally rising to match his wife's shrill accusations. Somewhere, a door slammed with enough force to rattle the rafters. By dawn, the manor buzzed with whispers. Servants who had once treated her with casual indifference now regarded her with a mixture of fear and resentment. Cook refused to meet her eyes when handing her stale bread for breakfast, and the stablemaster set her to work with a grim expression that promised no mercy. "Think you're too good for horse shit now, girl?" he muttered as he thrust a pitchfork into her hands. "Got royal airs after one night at court?" Ellen worked mechanically, her body moving through familiar motions while her mind spun with questions. Sweat soaked through her dress despite the morning chill, and her muscles screamed in protest at tasks she usually performed with practiced ease. As she hauled water from the well, two village girls stopped their conversation to stare, their expressions hungry for gossip. "That's her," one whispered loudly enough to be heard. "The one the king kissed." "Can't see why," replied the other, eyeing Ellen's plain features and work-roughened appearance. "They say she dabbles in dark arts. My brother's wife's cousin serves in the castle kitchens. Says the whole court believes it's witchcraft." The news had spread faster than wildfire, leaping from the castle to the village overnight. By midday, Ellen could feel eyes following her everywhere, speculation and judgment weighing on her like physical stones. Even Thomas, the blacksmith's son who had once shared stolen apples with her during harvest festivals, crossed to the other side of the courtyard to avoid her path. Isolation wrapped around her like a second skin as she kneaded dough in the kitchen, flour coating her hands and forearms. Each punch into the yielding mass released a fraction of her turmoil. Why had the king done this to her? A cruel joke at her expense? A calculated insult to the noble families? Or something else entirely, something she dared not even consider? "Put your back into it, girl," snapped Cook, breaking into her thoughts. "Daydreaming of crowns and scepters won't get the bread baked." Laughter erupted from the scullery maids, quickly stifled when Cook shot them a warning glance. Ellen pressed her lips together and redoubled her efforts, forcing the questions away. She was nothing and no one, an orphan without family or connections. Whatever had happened last night was a mistake, an aberration that would soon be forgotten. Late afternoon brought a commotion to the manor's front gate. From the kitchen window, Ellen watched a royal messenger dismount from a lathered horse. Her heart lodged somewhere in her throat, beating wildly against the confines of her chest. She abandoned the vegetables she'd been peeling and moved closer to the door, straining to hear the exchange in the entrance hall. Lord Ravenswood's voice carried first, unusually high with stress. "A royal summons? There must be some mistake." "No mistake, my lord," came the messenger's clipped reply. "By order of His Majesty, the girl known as Ellen is to present herself at court tomorrow at the hour of noon." A crash, Lady Ravenswood dropping something fragile, followed by a strangled sound that might have been either laughter or a sob. "This is madness. The girl is nothing, a servant in our household. Surely the king doesn't seriously intend. His Majesty's orders were explicit, my lady. The girl is to appear, alone." Footsteps approached the kitchen, heavy and purposeful. Ellen barely had time to resume her position at the vegetable table before the door swung open. Lord Ravenswood stood there, his face ashen beneath his beard, a rolled parchment clutched in one trembling hand. Behind him hovered Lady Ravenswood, her expression oscillating between rage and calculation. "It seems," Lord Ravenswood said, his voice unnaturally controlled, "that you have been summoned to court." He thrust the parchment toward her. Ellen took it with flour-covered fingers, leaving white smudges on the rich material. The royal seal, red wax impressed with the kingdom's crest, seemed to pulse in the kitchen's dim light. Her hands shook so badly she could barely unroll it. The message was brief, the handwriting elegant and authoritative. The king commanded her presence. Not requested, commanded. Tomorrow at noon. "What game are you playing, girl?" Lady Ravenswood hissed, advancing on her. "What lies have you told? What schemes have you hatched?" "None, my lady," Ellen whispered, her voice small in the suddenly silent kitchen. "I swear on my life." Lady Ravenswood's eyes narrowed to slits. "Your life may well be what's at stake, if you've brought dishonor to this house." She broke off, snatching the parchment back. You'll go. You'll do whatever the king asks, answer whatever questions he poses, and then you'll return here and never speak of it again. The parchment trembled in Lady Ravenswood's grasp, the royal seal catching the light from the kitchen window. Ellen stared at it, transfixed by the impossible truth it represented. The king, ruler of the realm, most powerful man in 7 kingdoms, wanted to see her again. Fear and something dangerously close to hope warred in her chest. Why would he summon her? What could he possibly want from an orphaned servant with nothing to offer but calloused hands and downcast eyes? And more terrifying still, what would happen to her when this inexplicable royal interest inevitably faded? Dawn broke with reluctant fingers of light that barely penetrated the morning mist. Ellen had not slept. Her body ached from yesterday's punishing labor, but it was the knot of dread in her stomach that kept her eyes fixed on the ceiling beams throughout the endless night. The summons, that impossible document with its blood-red seal, lay hidden beneath her thin mattress, its presence radiating through the straw like heat from banked coals. Lady Ravenswood arrived as the manor's clock chimed 8, flanked by 2 grim-faced housemaids carrying buckets of steaming water. Her gaze swept the tiny attic room with undisguised contempt. "You cannot appear before His Majesty looking like a swineherd," she announced, nostrils flaring. "It would reflect poorly on our household." The bath that followed was both blessing and torment. Ellen sat rigid as the maids scrubbed her skin raw, their movements mechanical and impersonal. No one spoke. Even the splashing water seemed muted, as if the very air in the room feared to disturb the suffocating tension. When they dragged a comb through her tangled hair, tearing at knots that had formed over days of work without proper attention, Ellen bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper rather than cry out. "You will wear this," Lady Ravenswood said, laying out a dress Ellen recognized as one Cecily had outgrown, simple by noble standards, but finer than anything Ellen had ever worn. "It's plain enough not to give you ideas above your station, yet decent enough to avoid embarrassing us further." The fabric felt alien against Ellen's freshly scrubbed skin, too soft, too unfamiliar. Her hands kept straying to the sleeves, picking at the stitching in nervous habit until Lady Ravenswood slapped them away. "Listen carefully," the woman hissed, gripping Ellen's shoulders with painful intensity. "Whatever game the king plays, it ends today. You will answer his questions with humility and brevity. You will not embellish or seek sympathy. When dismissed, you will return directly here. Do you understand?" Ellen nodded, her throat too tight for words. "If you bring further shame to this house," Lady Ravenswood continued, her fingers digging deeper, "there will be no place for you here, or anywhere within 100 miles. Remember that when you stand before the throne." The journey to the castle passed in blur of terror and disbelief. The carriage, sent by the king himself, much to Lady Ravenswood's thinly veiled fury, moved through streets lined with curious onlookers. Word had spread. Faces pressed close to the windows, hungry eyes seeking a glimpse of the nobody who had somehow caught royal attention. "The nerve," muttered Lady Ravenswood, who had insisted on accompanying her despite the summons specifically requesting Ellen alone. "Sending a royal carriage for a servant. People will talk for months." Ellen's hands twisted in her lap, nails digging half-moons into her palms. Her chest felt hollowed out, scraped clean of everything but fear. What could she possibly say to a king? What words could cross the vast chasm between their worlds without sounding either pathetically ingratiating or dangerously presumptuous? The castle loomed ever closer, its stone towers piercing the sky like accusing fingers. The throne room swallowed Ellen in waves of color, sound, and scent. Tapestries depicting ancient battles covered walls that stretched toward heaven. Courtiers in silks and velvets clustered in tight groups, their jewels catching light from high windows. The air hung heavy with perfumes, sweat, and ambition. And everywhere, eyes, calculating, curious, contemptuous, tracked her progress across the polished floor. "The orphan girl," someone whispered too loudly. "The one from yesterday." "A serving girl," came another voice, dripping with disdain. "My cook says she scrubs pots at Ravenswood Manor." Mad, completely mad. The king must be bewitched. Lady Ravenswood moved ahead, her spine rigid with determination, but a royal guard stepped forward, blocking her path. "Only the girl," he stated, voice flat and final. Those were His Majesty's explicit instructions. Color flooded Lady Ravenswood's face. "I am her guardian. She is not of age and cannot—" "Only the girl," the guard repeated, unmoved. His hand rested meaningfully on the pommel of his sword. For a moment, rebellion flashed in Lady Ravenswood's eyes. Then calculation replaced it. With a tight smile, she stepped back. "Of course. We live to serve His Majesty's will." She leaned close to Ellen, her breath warm against her ear. "Remember what I said. Humility and brevity. Your future depends on it." Then Ellen was alone, adrift in a sea of hostile faces. The guard gestured for her to continue forward. Each step felt impossibly difficult, as if her feet had transformed to lead. The whispering intensified, a malevolent hiss that followed her approach to the throne. The king sat with deceptive casualness, one leg crossed over the other. His crown, a simple gold circlet set with 3 rubies, caught the light from high windows. Behind him stood a row of stern-faced advisors, their elaborate robes marking their rank and importance. One, a gray-bearded man with sharp eyes, studied her with particular intensity, his mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Ellen managed a clumsy curtsy when she reached the appropriate distance, her borrowed dress catching awkwardly beneath her inexperienced movements. A titter of laughter rippled through the court, quickly silenced by the king's raised hand. "Ellen of Nowhere in particular," he said, and the familiar words in his mouth made her chest tighten. "I'm pleased you accepted my invitation." Not a summons in his telling, but an invitation, as if she had had any choice. "Your Majesty honors me beyond my worth," she replied, the practiced phrase falling from dry lips. Lady Ravenswood had drilled the words into her throughout the carriage ride. Something like disappointment flickered across the king's face. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, an informal posture that caused several advisors to exchange alarmed glances. "I would hear your voice, Ellen," he said, quieter now, though in the hushed hall every word carried. "Not the voice they have taught you to use in my presence, but your own." Confusion tangled in her chest. What did he mean? What game was this? She remained silent, paralyzed between terror and incomprehension. The king's eyes, deep brown with flecks of amber, held hers steadily. "Yesterday, when asked your name, you answered with honesty. Ellen of Nowhere in particular. Not your humble servant or some other practiced obsequiousness, just truth." He stood, causing a ripple of movement as courtiers straightened their postures. "I would know more truths from you. Who are you, Ellen? Not your station or your duties, but you." The question hung in the air between them, impossible and dangerous. Behind her she could feel the court's collective breath held in anticipation. Before her the king waited with unsettling patience. In that suspended moment, Ellen faced the most terrifying choice of her life. She could give him what he surely expected, a tearful, grateful nothing of a girl, pathetically eager for royal attention. She could repeat the story Lady Ravenswood had prepared, humble and forgettable. She would return to the manor, back to her invisible existence, and this strange interlude would fade like morning mist. Or she could speak, really speak. Her heart hammered against her ribs as possibilities unfolded. If she opened herself truly, shared the hollow ache of abandonment, the years of swallowed pride, the small moments of beauty she hoarded like precious stones, what then? Ridicule? Dismissal? Or something else entirely? The silence stretched. A courtier coughed. Someone shuffled impatiently. The gray-bearded advisor leaned toward the king, clearly intending to whisper something in his ear. "I am the daughter of no one," Ellen said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. The words emerged stronger than she'd expected, propelled by something fierce and unfamiliar. "Left at the abbey gates wrapped in a blanket too coarse for a nobleman's horse." The advisor froze mid-motion. The king settled back, eyes intent on her face. "The sisters named me for St. Ellen, though they called me Ellen because another girl already had the saint's name proper." The words came faster now, tumbling out like water through a broken dam. I slept on straw pallets with 11 other foundlings until I was 7 years old. In winter, we huddled together for warmth, our breath making clouds in the freezing dormitory. She could feel Lady Ravenswood's fury from across the room, could imagine the woman's face mottled with rage at this unscripted outpouring. Yet she continued, unable to stop now that the first truths had escaped. When fever swept the abbey, 3 children died in one night. I survived only because Sister Agnes broke the rules to feed me honey and willow bark tea. Her voice caught on the memory of the old nun's gnarled hands, gentle despite their arthritis. When Lord and Lady Ravenswood visited seeking a servant girl old enough to work but young enough to train, I was chosen because I was neither the prettiest nor the plainest, just unremarkable enough not to cause trouble. A strange hush had fallen over the throne room. Even the most jaded courtiers seemed transfixed by her quiet recitation. The king remained motionless, his expression unreadable. "I have spent 10 years in their household," Ellen continued, each word both terrifying and liberating. "I am grateful for the roof, the meals, the place, but I am always reminded that gratitude is expected, that my existence is a burden generously borne by others." She stopped, suddenly aware of how far beyond propriety she had strayed. Her hands trembled, and she clasped them tightly to still their betrayal of her fear. The throne room remained eerily silent, dozens of eyes fixed upon her face. "And yet," the king said finally, his voice gentle, "despite all this, you still see beauty in the world. Don't you, Ellen?" The question pierced her with its unexpected perception. How could he know about her secret collection? The robin's feather tucked between the pages of the kitchen's account book, the perfect acorn kept in a box beneath her bed, the fragment of blue glass that caught the light just so. "Yes, your majesty," she whispered, vulnerability raw in her voice. "Beauty finds ways to exist even in shadows." Something shifted in his gaze, a softening, a recognition. He nodded once as if she had confirmed a private theory. "Thank you for your honesty," he said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "It is a rare and precious thing, especially in these rooms." He turned to the nearest advisor. "See that Lady Ellen is provided refreshment before her return journey." Lady Ellen. The title fell like a thunderbolt in the silent hall. Not the girl or the orphan or even just Ellen, but Lady Ellen, a designation that, while not noble, acknowledged her as a person of some standing. As she was led from the throne room on shaking legs, Ellen caught fragments of furious whispers in her wake. The court's incomprehension was palpable, their confusion tinged with nascent fear. What was happening? What did the king intend? And what would become of a servant girl who had just spoken unvarnished truth to the most powerful man in the realm? Behind her she felt his eyes follow her exit, and with them a terrible certainty. Nothing would ever be the same again. Fire burned in Ellen's cheeks as the royal guards escorted her from the castle. The afternoon sun struck her face with unexpected harshness, momentarily blinding her after the dim grandeur of the throne room. Her tongue felt thick, her mouth dry, the taste of her own audacity lingering like metal. What madness had possessed her to speak so plainly before the king, before the entire court? Lady Ravenswood stood by the royal carriage, her face a perfect mask that barely contained the fury beneath. "Get in," she hissed, fingers digging into Ellen's arm hard enough to leave bruises. "Not a word until we're away from here." The carriage lurched forward, wheels clattering against cobblestones. Through the window, Ellen caught fragmented images. A group of kitchen servants pausing their work to stare. Noble ladies huddled in whispered conversation. A messenger on horseback galloping toward the city. News was already spreading, faster than wildfire in summer drought. "Have you lost your mind entirely?" Lady Ravenswood finally erupted when they passed through the castle gates. 10 years we've fed you, clothed you, given you purpose beyond begging in gutters, and you repay us with public humiliation." Ellen's hands twisted in her lap. "I only answered His Majesty's question truthfully." "Truthfully?" Lady Ravenswood's laugh held no humor, only brittle anger. "You painted us as cruel masters, yourself as a martyred saint. Do you understand what you've done? The entire court will talk of nothing else for weeks. Our standing, our very position in society, teeters on the brink because of your Your performance. The word performance sliced through Ellen's chest. Had it been just that? A desperate grab for attention, for significance? No, she thought, steadying herself. She had spoken her truth, perhaps for the first time in her life. "The king called me Lady Ellen," she whispered, half to herself. Lady Ravenswood's face contorted, the careful lines of her makeup creasing with her scowl. A momentary indulgence from a bored monarch. Do not mistake it for anything more. But something had changed. Ellen could feel it in the air around her, in the tingling awareness of her own skin. The borrowed dress no longer felt quite so alien, her spine a fraction straighter. She had spoken, and the king had listened. By nightfall, Ravenswood Manor simmered with ugly tension. Servants who had ignored Ellen for years now watched her with wary, speculative eyes. Cook banged pots with unnecessary force, muttering about ideas above stations whenever Ellen entered the kitchen. The stable boy, who had once shared stolen apples with her, now spat on the ground as she passed. Lord Ravenswood sequestered himself in his study, emerging only for a terse family dinner where Ellen was forbidden to serve, relegated instead to washing dishes in the scullery. Through the kitchen door left slightly ajar, she heard fragments of conversation. "Entire duchy laughing behind our backs." Baron Highfield withdrew his son's interest in Cecily. "Our reputation cannot withstand another such incident." Later, sprawled on her thin mattress, Ellen pressed her palms against her eyes until stars burst behind her eyelids. The weight of the day pressed down, making each breath a conscious effort. Outside her tiny window, crickets sang their nightly chorus, indifferent to human concerns. What would happen now? Where did one step after speaking truth to a king? Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by dreams of falling from great heights. Dawn brought new whispers. A kitchen maid returning from the village market reported that Ellen's name traveled from tavern to shop, from well to chapel. "They're saying you've bewitched him," the girl said, unable to hide her morbid fascination. "Old Widow Thatcher claims she saw you gathering herbs at midnight during the full moon." "Ridiculous," Ellen murmured, focusing on kneading dough with unnecessary force. "I've never gathered herbs at night. Thomas the blacksmith's son says the king means to make you his mistress." The girl's eyes widened. "Is it true? Did he offer you jewels? Silk dresses?" The suggestion sent heat flaring up Ellen's neck. "He offered nothing but courtesy. Now please, the bread won't bake itself." But the questions and rumors multiplied with each passing hour. By midday, a delegation of local gentry arrived, ostensibly to discuss harvest matters with Lord Ravenswood. Their real purpose was transparent: to glimpse the serving girl who had somehow caught royal attention. Lady Ravenswood ordered Ellen confined to the laundry room, away from curious eyes. "You've caused enough spectacle," she snapped. "Your name is mud in 3 counties." Elbow deep in scalding water, scrubbing linens until her fingers cracked and bled, Ellen fought back tears of frustration. She had done nothing but speak when spoken to, answer when asked. Yet somehow she had become the center of a storm. 3 days passed in this fashion. The Ravenswoods publicly distanced themselves, introducing her as the orphan taken in through Christian charity, rather than by name when forced to acknowledge her presence. In the village, mothers pulled their children closer when she passed, as if proximity might taint them. The local priest watched her with narrowed eyes during Sunday service, his sermon dwelling pointedly on the dangers of pride and ambition. On the 4th morning, another royal messenger arrived. The summons bore the same blood-red seal, the same authoritative script. This time, however, the message contained additional instructions. Ellen was to come alone at sunset, entering through the East Garden Gate rather than the main entrance. Discretion, it seemed, was now preferred. Lady Ravenswood read the message twice, her mouth tightening. "So it begins," she said, almost to herself. "What begins, my lady?" Ellen asked, confusion churning in her stomach. His true intentions. Lady Ravenswood's eyes were cold as she studied Ellen's face. "A king does not continue to summon a common serving girl for conversation, child, especially not at sunset, through private entrances." Comprehension dawned slowly, followed by horrified denial. "No, he wouldn't. I'm not— You'll go. Lady Ravenswood cut her off. You'll do whatever is asked of you. Our family has suffered enough because of your elevation. Perhaps you can finally be of some use to this household by securing royal favor. Bile rose in Ellen's throat. The idea that the king, who had seemed to value her honesty, who had looked at her with such genuine interest, might harbor such base intentions, turned her stomach. Yet doubt crept in like morning fog. What other explanation could there be? The sunset meeting proved her fears both right and wrong. The king awaited her in a small courtyard garden, roses climbing stone walls that ensured privacy. No crown adorned his head, his clothing simpler than court attire, though still finer than anything a commoner might wear. Only 2 guards stood at a discreet distance, positioned to prevent interruption rather than escape. You came, he said simply, rising from a stone bench as she approached. I wasn't certain you would. Ellen cursed awkwardly, her borrowed dress, another of Cecily's cast-offs, catching beneath her feet. Your Majesty commands, I obey. A frown crossed his face. Not a command, Ellen. An invitation. Invitations can be declined, she said before she could stop herself. Summonses cannot. His laugh startled her, genuine, warm, devoid of mockery. You speak your mind even now. Good. Please, sit. He gestured to the bench beside him. Cautiously, Ellen perched at the farthest end, maintaining careful distance. The flagstones beneath her feet still held the day's warmth. A honeybee buzzed lazily among the roses, seemingly unconcerned that it shared space with a king. I have been thinking of our conversation, he said after a moment of surprisingly comfortable silence. Your life at the Abbey, at Ravenswood Manor. Ellen's hands twisted in her lap. I fear I spoke too freely, Your Majesty. On the contrary, you spoke with refreshing honesty. His eyes, those unsettlingly perceptive eyes, studied her face. Tell me, what was it like, growing up without parents, without knowing your origins? The question struck deeper than he could know. Ellen stared at a climbing rose, its petals unfurling toward fading sunlight. Like missing a limb you never had, she said finally. You learn to function without it because you must. But sometimes you feel the absence more acutely than others. He nodded, as if she had confirmed something important. They spoke until darkness fell completely, the king asking questions about her life, her observations, her small joys and sorrows. Not once did he touch her. Not once did his gaze wander inappropriately. Instead, he listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made Ellen feel simultaneously exposed and valued. When a clock chimed 9, he sighed. I've kept you too long. The carriage will return you safely. Ellen rose, bewildered by the entire encounter. May I ask why, Your Majesty? Why speak with me at all? Something flickered in his expression. Hesitation, perhaps. Because you see what others overlook. Because your perspective is necessary. The answer, cryptic as it was, haunted Ellen through the silent journey back to Ravenswood Manor. Lady Ravenswood awaited her return, eyes sharp with speculation. Finding no gifts, no jewelry, no signs of royal favor, only a thoughtful silence. Her disappointment curdled to suspicion. What game does he play? She demanded. What purpose do these meetings serve? Ellen shook her head, unable to articulate the strange connection she'd felt, the uncanny sense of being truly heard perhaps for the first time in her life. The summonses continued. Twice weekly, always at sunset, always through private entrances, always conversations, nothing more. The king asked about village life, about the suffering of common folk, about traditions and beliefs the nobility rarely witnessed. He spoke little of himself, though occasionally shared burdens of rulership, decisions that weighed heavily upon him. With each meeting, rumors grew wilder. Speculation turned to certainty in the minds of many. The orphan girl had ensnared the king through witchcraft or exotic skills learned in brothels. Never mind that Ellen had never set foot in such establishments, had never even left the county of her birth. The story was too delicious to abandon for mere facts. Court ladies who had once ignored her existence now regarded her with venomous jealousy. During a rare public appearance beside the king for a harvest festival, Duchess Hargrove spilled wine on Ellen's dress, accidentally, her smile never reaching her cold eyes. "Enjoy His Majesty's attention while it lasts, little mouse," she murmured for Ellen's ears alone. Kings tire quickly of simple amusements. More dangerous than jealous noblewomen were the king's advisors. Lord Chancellor Blackwood, the gray-bearded man who had watched her so intently during her first audience, now observed her with undisguised hostility. Whispered conversations ceased when she approached. Documents disappeared beneath hands when she entered rooms. Something was brewing, something darker than mere social disapproval. Confirmation came on a cold autumn evening. Returning to her attic room after another royal audience, Ellen found a folded paper on her pillow. No seal marked its origin. With trembling fingers, she opened it to find a message written in a deliberate hand. "The king's pet has been noticed. Not all appreciate his new fascination. If you value your life, disappear before you are made to disappear. This is your only warning." The paper shook in her grasp, its edges blurring as tears filled her eyes. Not merely disliked, not merely resented, but threatened. In the silence of her tiny room, with only moonlight as witness, Ellen faced the terrifying truth. Her honesty, the very quality the king valued, had made her enemies powerful enough to contemplate murder. Sleep became Ellen's enemy. Night after night, she lay rigid beneath her thin blanket, ears straining at every creak of the ancient manor, every whisper of wind against the shutters. The threat, that single sheet of parchment with its deadly promise, she had burned immediately, watching the ash float away like dark snow. Yet the words remained branded in her mind, flaring to life each time she closed her eyes. "If you value your life, disappear before you are made to disappear." A mouse scuttled somewhere in the rafters. Ellen's heart leaped painfully against her ribs, her body instantly drenched in cold sweat. Was it truly a mouse, or someone moving across the attic floor toward her room? Her fingers closed around the kitchen knife she'd begun keeping beneath her pillow, a pathetically small defense against whatever faceless enemies now marked her for destruction. By dawn, bruise-colored shadows had formed beneath her eyes, her skin taking on the pallor of old parchment. The manor stirred to life around her, servants lighting fires, cook banging pots in the kitchen, stable boys shouting to each other across the yard. But Ellen moved through it all like a ghost, present yet disconnected. "You look terrible," Cecily Ravenswood commented during breakfast preparations, her voice pitched deliberately loud enough for the other servants to hear. "Perhaps your midnight assignations with His Majesty are proving too vigorous." Titters rippled through the kitchen. Ellen kept her eyes fixed on the bread she was slicing, but her cheeks burned with the injustice of the insinuation. The king had never touched her, had shown nothing but respect during their conversations. "Our family's invitation to the Harvest Moon Ball was rescinded yesterday," Cecily continued, casually examining her fingernails. "Father says we have you to thank for that. Our social standing diminishes daily while you rise in royal favor." "I've asked for nothing," Ellen said quietly, the knife trembling slightly in her grasp. "Asked for nothing?" Lady Ravenswood's voice cut through the kitchen as she swept in, face already arranged in its daily mask of cold dignity. "You've cost us everything." Lord Hargrove's son no longer calls on Cecily. "Merchant wives who once sought my approval now whisper behind their hands when I pass. Even the village priest speaks of moral corruption in our household." She leaned closer, voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "All because you couldn't remain in your proper place." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Ellen's shoulders hunched instinctively, years of submission rising to the surface despite her recent glimpses of another possible life. "I never meant. Intent matters little when the damage is done." Lady Ravenswood cut her off. "You are the architect of our downfall, girl. Remember that." The weight of blame settled on Ellen's shoulders, familiar yet heavier than before. Throughout the manor, servants who had worked alongside her for years now treated her as either pariah or potential savior. Cook refused to let her handle food for the family's meals, muttering about poisons and potions. The stable master watched her with open hostility, his hand often straying to the whip at his belt when she passed. Yet others, particularly the youngest serving girls and the old gardener with his twisted back, had begun to approach her with tentative respect, sometimes slipping extra bread or a windfall apple into her hands with whispered thanks for showing them all that even the lowest can rise. This division extended beyond Ravenswood Manor. In the village, the tavern erupted nightly into heated debates about the orphan girl and the king. Some claimed she represented hope for commoners everywhere. Others insisted she was a harbinger of chaos, upsetting the natural order of society. "The balance teeters," wheezed old Marta, the herb woman, when Ellen ventured to her cottage seeking a remedy for sleeplessness. The ancient woman's rheumy eyes narrowed as she crushed dried valerian between gnarled fingers. "They fear you, girl. Not for what you are, but for what you represent." "And what is that?" Ellen asked, accepting the small pouch of herbs with hands that hadn't stopped trembling for days. "The possibility of change." Marta's toothless smile held no comfort. Nothing frightens the powerful more than the idea that their power might not be ordained by God after all. That afternoon, a royal messenger arrived, bearing not the usual private summons, but a formal invitation. The king requested Ellen's presence at a small banquet to be held the following evening. Not in the great hall where hundreds might witness, but in the more intimate setting of the royal solar, where only 20 carefully selected guests would attend. Lady Ravenswood's face twisted with naked envy as she read the invitation. "A royal banquet," she hissed, "while we, a family of ancient lineage, are shunned from public gatherings." "Perhaps," Lord Ravenswood suggested carefully, his voice lowered, though Ellen could still hear from her position by the door, "we should reconsider our approach. If the king's interest in the girl continues, opposing it directly may prove unwise." The look his wife gave him could have curdled milk. "You suggest we smile and nod while our family name becomes a laughingstock? While an orphan of unknown parentage usurps the position our daughters should hold?" Their argument continued behind closed doors, but the outcome was clear. The next evening, Ellen departed for the castle in the royal carriage, wearing a dress of deep blue linen, simple by court standards but finer than anything she'd ever owned. It had arrived that morning, accompanied by a note in the king's own hand, "That you might be comfortable among us." The royal solar glowed with the warm light of beeswax candles, their honey scent mingling with roasting meat and mulled wine. The room, smaller and less imposing than the great hall, was arranged with a single long table rather than the traditional high table and lower seating. The king stood as Ellen entered, his smile genuine, though his eyes held a wariness she hadn't seen before. "Lady Ellen," he greeted her, loud enough for all to hear the title he insisted upon using. "You honor us with your presence." The assembled guests, a careful mixture of progressive younger nobles, respected merchants, and a few of the king's closest advisors, offered bows and curtsies of varying enthusiasm. Lord Chancellor Blackwood, seated at the king's right hand, merely inclined his head, his beard failing to hide the tightening of his jaw. "Your Majesty is too kind," Ellen managed, fighting the urge to retreat from so many evaluating stares. The king gestured to an empty seat near the center of the table, not at the far end where her rank might dictate, nor beside him where gossip would ignite, but in a position that suggested neither excessive favor nor deliberate distancing. Conversation flowed cautiously at first, stilted by the unusual composition of the gathering. Baron Wesley, a young nobleman known for his unconventional views on land reform, eventually broke the ice by asking Ellen directly about conditions in the village near Ravenswood Manor. "The harvest has been poor these past 3 years," she replied, carefully measuring her words. "Many families struggle to meet their tax obligations while still feeding their children." "Peasants always claim poverty when tax collectors appear," scoffed Lady Pembroke, an older noblewoman whose vast estates bordered the royal forests. "Yet somehow they find coin enough for ale at harvest festivals. A single day's respite from grinding poverty hardly disproves its existence," Ellen responded before she could stop herself. A hush fell over the table. The king's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, not quite a smile, but close. "Lady Ellen speaks from direct observation," he noted, "something few at this table can claim." "Indeed," drawled Lord Chancellor Blackwood, swirling wine in his goblet. "One wonders what other observations have so captured your Majesty's attention." The implication hung in the air like poison. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I value truth, Lord Chancellor, the king replied evenly, particularly from those with no reason to curry favor through flattery. And what truths has the lady shared? Pressed Blackwood, his tone superficially respectful, while his eyes remained cold. Insights into governance that have escaped your counselors these many years. The king set down his goblet with deliberate care. Lady Ellen has reminded me that a kingdom is more than its nobility, that suffering exists beyond castle walls, that perhaps our traditions of governance might benefit from perspectives beyond those born to privilege. The words fell like stones into still water, ripples of shock spreading outward. Baron Wesley nodded enthusiastically while Lady Pembroke's face hardened into outraged lines. The merchant Goodman Fletcher glanced nervously between the king and the chancellor, clearly calculating which way the political winds might blow. A commendable sentiment, Blackwood said smoothly, though perhaps one that overestimates the breadth of understanding possible for those without education or breeding. The king's smile vanished entirely. Birth determines much, Lord Chancellor, but not worth, not intelligence, not courage or compassion. Your Majesty suggests, then, that this young woman of unknown parentage, raised in servitude, possesses insights equal to those who have studied governance their entire lives. Blackwood's voice remained level, but challenge blazed in his eyes. I suggest, the king said, his tone hardening to steel, that no person at this table or beyond should be judged by circumstances of birth rather than character and actions. The declaration hung in the air, radical and dangerous. Several nobles exchanged alarmed glances. The youngest daughter of the Earl of Hawthorne looked at Ellen with newfound curiosity, while an elderly advisor near the table's end shook his head in clear disapproval. A noble sentiment, Blackwood conceded with a tight smile, though one that, implemented broadly, might destabilize the very foundations upon which the realm stands. Perhaps, the king countered, some foundations require examination. The conversation shifted after that, turning to safer topics of hunts and harvests, though undercurrents of tension remained. Throughout the meal, Ellen maintained a careful silence, hyper-aware of the dangerous waters into which she had been thrust. This was no mere social occasion. It was a battlefield where ideas clashed instead of swords. As the dessert course was served, honey cakes drizzled with imported cinnamon, Ellen noticed a silent exchange. Lord Chancellor Blackwood caught the eye of Baron Hargrove across the table, a barely perceptible nod passing between them. The Baron's gaze then shifted to the king's cupbearer, a young man whose face remained carefully blank. Something cold slithered down Ellen's spine. She watched with growing alarm as the cupbearer approached the king with a freshly filled goblet. Without thinking, Ellen reached for her own untouched wine, accidentally knocking it over. Red liquid spread across the white tablecloth like blood, spattering the king's sleeve. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," she gasped, mortification burning her cheeks as servants rushed forward with cloths. In the confusion, the cupbearer withdrew, taking the suspicious goblet with him. The king waved away her apologies, but something in his eyes suggested he had noted both her clumsiness and the direction of her gaze before the incident. As the banquet concluded and guests began to depart, he held her back with a light touch on her arm. "Walk with me a moment," he murmured, guiding her toward a small antechamber off the main solar. Once alone, he turned to her, all pretense of royal distance abandoned. "You saw something tonight. What was it?" Ellen hesitated, suddenly terrified of the implications. To accuse the Lord Chancellor, the second most powerful man in the realm, of plotting against the king himself. "Speak freely," he urged. "Please, Ellen." "A look," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Between Lord Chancellor Blackwood and Baron Hargrove. Then both looked to your cupbearer." She swallowed hard. "It may have been nothing." The king's expression darkened. "Or everything." He paced the small room, tension evident in every line of his body. "I've suspected for some time that certain factions disapprove of my evolving perspectives. They see me as the cause," Ellen realized aloud. "They believe I've influenced you toward dangerous ideas." "You have," he admitted with unexpected candor. "Though the seeds were already planted, you've merely helped them grow." Fear gripped her heart. Then I've placed you in danger." His laugh held no humor. "I was born into danger, Ellen. A crown is a target as much as a symbol of power." He stopped pacing, fixing her with an intent gaze. "But now you are in danger too, and for that I am deeply sorry." The truth of it settled between them, weighty and inescapable. She was no longer merely an oddity, a commoner, briefly elevated by royal whim. She had become, in the eyes of powerful men, a threat to the established order, something to be eliminated. "What happens now?" she whispered, her future suddenly as dark and uncertain as the shadows gathering in the corners of the small room. "Now," the king said grimly, "we must be very, very careful." Dawn broke with an unnatural redness, as if the sky itself bled with foreboding. Ellen woke to rough hands pulling her from bed, her sleep-fogged mind struggling to comprehend the shadowy figures looming over her. Two village guardsmen, their faces carefully blank, stood flanking a red-faced Lord Ravenswood. "Get dressed," he ordered, tossing a simple gray dress onto her bed. "Quickly." "What's happening?" Her voice cracked, throat dry from restless sleep. No one answered. Through the tiny window, she could hear unusual commotion in the courtyard below. Voices raised in argument, horses snorting and stamping. A knot formed in her stomach, cold and heavy as river stone. "The bishop's men arrived at dawn," Lord Ravenswood finally said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Accusations have been made, formal ones." The words hung in the air between them, their full implication crystallizing like ice in her veins. Accusations. The bishop's men. There was only one kind of accusation that would bring church authorities to Ravenswood Manor at first light. Witchcraft. Her fingers fumbled with the dress, suddenly numb and clumsy. The rough wool scraped against her skin as she pulled it over her head, a far cry from the fine blue linen she'd worn to the king's banquet. No one offered to help, though she struggled with the back lacings. The silence pressed against her ears, broken only by the impatient shifting of the guards. "I've done nothing," she whispered, more to herself than to the men watching her with cold eyes. Lord Ravenswood's laugh held no humor. "Tell that to the crowd gathering in the square." They bound her hands, not tightly enough to cause pain, but securely enough to mark her as accused. The coarse rope bit into her wrists as she was led downstairs. In the main hall, Lady Ravenswood stood with her daughters, their faces a study in mixed emotions. Fear, vindication, uncertainty. "I warned you," Lady Ravenswood said softly as Ellen passed. "I warned you that rising above your station would end badly." Outside, a small procession had formed. The bishop's representative, a thin man with eyes like chips of flint, sat astride a black gelding, his severe clerical robes making him resemble a crow perched above the chaos. 4 church guards flanked him, their expressions hidden beneath metal helmets. Behind them waited a simple wooden cart. "The accused will ride in the cart," the cleric announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of one used to being obeyed without question. "Let the people see what happens when unnatural ambitions corrupt the social order." Ellen's legs nearly buckled as understanding dawned. This was not merely an accusation, it was to be a public spectacle. They meant to parade her through the streets like a criminal, to make an example of her before any formal hearing or trial. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a desperate prayer. Not like this. Please, not like this. Yet she allowed herself to be helped into the cart, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her struggle or plead. The rough wooden planks scraped her palms as she steadied herself. Across the courtyard, she caught sight of Cook watching from the kitchen doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth. The youngest scullery maid was openly crying. The journey to the town square passed in a blur of noise and motion. Word of her coming had spread faster than the cart could travel. Villagers lined the muddy streets, craning for a glimpse of the orphan girl who had dared reach beyond her station. Some faces showed open hostility, others confusion or pity. A few, mostly the poorest laborers and their families, watched with something that might have been hope, quickly disguised when the church guards looked their way. "Witch," someone called from the crowd as they entered the main thoroughfare. The accusation hung in the air, then multiplied as others took up the cry. "Enchantress, Devil's whore! Ellen flinched at each shout, each word a physical blow. Yet alongside the condemnation came other voices. "She speaks for us," cried an old woman, her face weathered from decades in the fields. "Leave her be," shouted a blacksmith's apprentice, soot still streaking his young face. "The king chose her. The king sees her worth," called others. By the time they reached the town square, a true division had formed, the wealthier townsfolk and those dependent on noble patronage calling for her punishment, while the poorest laborers and those with little to lose defended her. The tension vibrated in the air like heat from a forge, nearly visible in its intensity. At the center of the square stood a raised wooden platform, hastily constructed but sturdy enough for its grim purpose. Ellen's stomach lurched at the sight. Not a pyre, not yet. But the message was clear. This was where accusations became condemnations, where whispers became sentences. 2 guards pulled her from the cart, half dragging her toward the platform when her legs threatened to give way. The crowd's roar intensified as she mounted the rough wooden steps, their faces blurring into a sea of emotion. Hatred, fear, confusion, hope, all directed at her. The bishop's representative raised his hands, and a semblance of quiet fell over the square. "People of Westmere," he began, his voice carrying to the furthest corners, "we gather today to address a matter of grave concern to both church and crown. Before you stands Ellen of Ravenswood Manor, a girl of common birth and uncertain parentage, who has, through means as yet undetermined, gained unprecedented access to His Majesty." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The cleric continued, his tone hardening. "Witnesses report the king's behavior has altered dramatically since this girl entered his presence. His recent pronouncements challenging the natural order, the divine hierarchy established by God himself, suggest an unnatural influence. The accusations mounted, each more outlandish than the last. Ellen had been seen gathering herbs by moonlight. She had picked chamomile for cook's tea, but in daylight. Strange lights had appeared in her attic window. She sometimes read by candlelight when unable to sleep. Animals behaved oddly in her presence. The stable cat followed her because she saved scraps from the kitchen. Each accusation twisted innocent actions into sinister implications. The crowd's mood swung like a weather vane in changing winds, from hostile to uncertain, from frightened to angry. Ellen stood silent throughout, her face composed despite the terror clawing at her chest. To speak in her own defense now would only be seen as further evidence of unnatural confidence. "The Holy Church takes these matters seriously," the cleric concluded. "Bishop Thornwall himself will preside over an ecclesiastical inquiry to determine the nature of this girl's influence over our sovereign. Until then, she will remain in church custody." Church custody. The word sent ice through Ellen's veins. The church prisons were notorious. Damp stone cells where accused witches and heretics sometimes languished for months or years before their cases were decided. Many died awaiting judgment, their fates recorded as God's will rather than the result of starvation and disease. A movement at the edge of the square caught her attention. A royal standard appeared above the crowd, followed by mounted guards in the king's colors. The people parted hastily, creating a path through the press of bodies. Whispers surged like wind through summer wheat. The king comes." The bishop's representative faltered mid-sentence, his certainty visibly shaken. "This is a church matter," he said, though his voice had lost its authoritative edge. "The crown has no jurisdiction in cases of suspected witchcraft." The royal guardsmen formed a protective circle around the platform. Their captain, a weathered man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, addressed the cleric directly. "His Majesty disagrees." Then the king himself appeared, mounted on a magnificent bay stallion. He wore no crown, but his presence commanded attention more effectively than any royal regalia. The crowd fell to their knees in waves, until only the church representatives and Ellen herself remained standing. The king's eyes found hers immediately, relief flashing briefly across his features before his expression hardened into royal authority. He dismounted in one fluid movement and ascended the platform, ignoring the spluttered protests of the bishop's man. "Release her," he commanded, nodding toward Ellen's bound wrists. When the guards hesitated, the king himself stepped forward, drawing a small dagger from his belt. Ellen held her breath as the blade slipped between her skin and the ropes, the sharp edge facing outward to avoid cutting her. The bindings fell away, leaving angry red marks on her wrists. "People of Westmere," the king's voice carried across the now silent square, "you have been misled. This woman stands accused of influencing me through unnatural means. The truth is far simpler, though perhaps more difficult for some to accept." He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "I have listened to her because she speaks truth without fear or favor. I have valued her counsel because she sees what many born to privilege cannot, or will not, see." The bishop's representative found his voice at last. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, this girl has clearly—" Silence. The single word, spoken quietly but with absolute authority, cut through the cleric's objection. "You overstep, Brother Jerome. The Church investigates matters of faith, not matters of the Crown's judgment." Brother Jerome's face flushed with indignation. "When witchcraft threatens the throne, there is no witchcraft here," the king interrupted, his patience visibly thinning. "Only the desperate attempt of those who fear change to discredit what they cannot control." A murmur ran through the crowd, confusion, disbelief, and dawning understanding mingling in equal measure. The king turned to face them directly, his next words clear and deliberate. "Let me speak plainly, so there can be no further misunderstanding or malicious rumor. I, King Edward, fourth of that name, have not been bewitched or enchanted. I have, however, been awakened to truths long ignored by those in power. And in this woman—" He gestured toward Ellen, whose heart had nearly stopped at the intensity of the moment. "I have found not only wisdom, but qualities worthy of the highest respect." He drew a deep breath, and Ellen sensed what was coming, a heartbeat, before he spoke the words that would change everything. "It is therefore my intention, before God and these witnesses, to take Lady Ellen as my wife and queen." The silence that followed was absolute, as if every person in the square had forgotten how to breathe. Ellen herself stood frozen, certain she had misheard or misunderstood. The king marry her? An orphan, a servant, a nothing from nowhere? It was impossible. Incomprehensible. Then the square erupted. Shouts of outrage mingled with cries of joy and disbelief. A noblewoman fainted dead away, crumpling to the cobblestones despite her expensive dress. Brother Jerome's face had gone from red to purple, his mouth working soundlessly like a fish thrown onto dry land. "This is madness," someone shouted from the crowd. "Long live the king and his chosen queen," cried another voice. "Blasphemy," called a third. The king turned to Ellen, oblivious to the chaos spreading through the square. His eyes, those perceptive eyes that had seen her when no one else bothered to look, held a question. "I should have asked you first," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "But circumstances forced my hand." Ellen's mind reeled. Marriage to the king, becoming queen. The idea was so far beyond her imagining that she could form no coherent response. Her life as she had known it, the endless work, the invisibility, the careful smallness of her existence, had just been shattered beyond repair. "Why?" she finally managed, the question containing multitudes. His smile was both sad and determined. "Because the kingdom needs your perspective as much as I do. Because birth should not determine destiny. Because—" He hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty. "Because I have never met anyone who sees the world as clearly as you do." Around them, the crowd's reaction grew more volatile. Guards formed a protective ring as objects began to fly, rotten vegetables from some, flowers from others. The divide that Ellen had sensed growing throughout the kingdom now stood starkly revealed. Those who clung to tradition and hierarchy against those who dared hope for something different. And she, somehow, had become the symbol around which this battle would be fought. The castle walls, once a symbol of strength and protection, now felt like a prison to Ellen. 3 days had passed since the king's shocking announcement in the town square. 3 days of being hurried through stone corridors by grim-faced guards, of sleeping in chambers too grand for her peasant bones, of catching servants' sideways glances that ranged from awe to undisguised hatred. She hadn't seen the king since that moment on the platform. He had been immediately swept away by his advisors, his face set in lines of determination despite their obvious panic. Now she stood by the window of her assigned chamber, watching raindrops trace jagged paths down leaded glass. The courtyard below bustled with unusual activity. Carriages bearing the crests of noble houses from across the kingdom arrived in steady procession, disgorging lords and ladies whose faces, even from this distance, betrayed their fury. An emergency council, the handmaiden had whispered while helping Ellen dress that morning. The nobility demands audience with His Majesty. Her fingers traced the cold glass, her breath fogging the pain. What madness had possessed the king to make such a declaration? Marriage. To her, the concept remained as foreign as distant stars, impossible to grasp fully. She was nobody, had always been nobody, until his gaze had transformed her into something else entirely. But a queen? The thought made her stomach clench with terror. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. Sir Roland, captain of the royal guard and the only member of the court who treated her with neither contempt nor exaggerated deference, entered without waiting for permission. "My lady," he said, the title still awkward on his tongue. "His Majesty requests your presence in the small council chamber, immediately." Ellen's heart leapt into her throat. The council is meeting now. Roland's scarred face revealed nothing, but tension radiated from his armored frame. Yes, and it's not proceeding well. The journey through the castle corridors felt endless. Servants flattened themselves against walls as she passed, their eyes downcast but their whispers following like persistent shadows. Commoner queen, bewitch the king, doom upon the realm. Ellen kept her chin level despite the burning in her cheeks. She had survived 17 years of invisibility. She would not crumble under visibility now. Outside the council chamber, a cluster of nobles stood in heated conversation. They fell silent as she approached, their expressions hardening into masks of disdain. Duke Hargrove, whose son had once courted Cecily Ravenswood, made an elaborate show of stepping aside, as if her common blood might somehow stain his immaculate doublet. "The king's choice arrives," he announced, voice dripping with contempt. Baroness Whitcomb, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her ambition, smiled with serpentine coldness. How novel that council matters now require a scullery maid's perspective. Ellen met her gaze steadily, though her knees threatened to buckle beneath her borrowed dress. "I was summoned by His Majesty," she said simply. "Nothing more." "Nothing more," echoed Lord Blackwood, emerging from the chamber door. His gray beard couldn't hide the twist of his mouth. "Yet nothing less than the future of the realm hangs in the balance because of your enchantments." The chamber fell silent as Ellen entered. 20 noblemen and women sat around an oval table of polished oak, their faces uniformly hostile. At its head stood the king, his fingers splayed on the wooden surface as if physically bracing against their arguments. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, evidence of sleepless nights that matched her own. Relief crossed his features when he saw her, quickly replaced by something more guarded. "Lady Ellen," he said formally, "thank you for joining us." She curtsied, aware of how awkward the gesture remained despite days of hasty instruction. "Your Majesty." "Perhaps now," said Countess Lowell, her voice brittle with barely controlled rage. "His Majesty might explain to his intended exactly what her elevation would cost the kingdom." The king's jaw tightened. "Lady Ellen deserves to hear your concerns directly." "Continue, Lord Fairfield." An elderly man with arthritic hands shuffled parchments before him. "As I was saying before this interruption, House Fairfield controls the western trade routes. Should this unprecedented match proceed, we would be forced to reconsider our long-standing agreements with the Crown. House Thornwood would withdraw military support from the northern borders," added a broad-shouldered woman whose weathered face spoke of battles personally fought. "The Church cannot possibly sanction such a union," declared Bishop Thornwall himself, his presence explaining Brother Jerome's zealous actions in the square. "The divine order places each soul in its proper station. To elevate a commoner to royal consort defies God's will." One by one they delivered their threats, thinly veiled as concerns. Trade agreements severed. Military alliances dissolved, religious support withdrawn, grain shipments mysteriously delayed. Each statement drove a nail into the coffin of the king's declaration. Ellen's throat constricted as understanding dawned. The king's kingdom, his people, his legacy, everything he had worked to build, would crumble if he persisted in his intention to marry her. Her presence at his side would cost him everything. Enough, the king said finally, straightening to his full height. Your positions are clear. Then you'll reconsider this folly? Asked Duke Hargrove, poorly concealed triumph in his voice. The king's eyes found Ellen's across the chamber. Something unspoken passed between them. Regret, determination, a question. She felt tears threatening but forced them back. She would not weep before these vultures who would tear apart a kingdom to maintain their privileges. Leave us, the king commanded suddenly. All of you. Protests erupted immediately, but his raised hand silenced them. The council is adjourned until tomorrow. Lady Ellen and I will speak privately. The nobles departed with clear reluctance, whispers and significant glances exchanged as they filed through the heavy oak door. Lord Chancellor Blackwood was the last to leave, his cold eyes lingering on Ellen with naked hostility before the door closed behind him. Silence descended, thick enough to touch. The king moved first, crossing to a sideboard where he poured 2 goblets of wine with hands that trembled slightly. He offered one to Ellen, who accepted it without drinking. Now you understand, he said quietly, the storm we've unleashed. You cannot do this, she whispered, the words torn from her chest. You cannot risk your kingdom, your people's welfare, for me. He smiled sadly. Is that what you think this is? Some grand romantic gesture at the expense of my duties? Isn't it? Her voice cracked. You heard them. Every noble house threatens rebellion. The church itself stands against you. All because you declared intention to marry an orphaned servant girl. No. He set down his untouched wine with deliberate care. They stand against me because I threaten a system that preserves their power at the expense of the common people. You are merely the catalyst, Ellen, not the cause. She shook her head, unwilling to accept the distinction. It makes no difference. I cannot, will not be the reason your kingdom fractures. And if I release you, return you to Ravenswood Manor as if none of this happened? His eyes hardened. How long before you suffer an unfortunate accident? How long before they eliminate the source of their discomfort? The truth of his words settled like stone in her stomach. There was no going back, not to Ravenswood, not to invisibility, not to safety in smallness. The moment the king had noticed her in that crowded hall, her old life had ended forever. There must be another way, she said desperately. Some compromise that preserves your alliances. He paced the chamber, energy crackling from him like lightning before a storm. I've considered every option. If I withdraw my declaration, I appear weak, easily manipulated by noble pressure. If I proceed against their wishes, I risk open rebellion. He stopped suddenly. Unless, she echoed, hope flickering despite herself. The nobles claim to speak for tradition, for divine order. But who speaks for the people? The farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, tanners, the backbone of this kingdom? His expression transformed as an idea took shape. What if we let them decide? Ellen stared at him. The common people? Decide a matter of state? Why not? It is their lives affected by who sits on the throne, by the policies enacted in their name. Excitement colored his voice. We could call an assembly, representatives from every guild, every village and town. Let them vote on whether a commoner might be queen. The audacity of the proposal stole her breath. No monarch has ever. It's unprecedented. Precisely. His smile held no humor. The nobles fear change above all else. This would show them that change comes whether they wish it or not. Fear and something dangerously close to hope warred in Ellen's chest. They'll never accept it. They need not accept. They need only witness. He moved closer, taking her hands in his. Ellen, I would marry you regardless of these politics. But I believe, truly believe, that your perspective, your experiences, Your understanding of ordinary lives could transform this kingdom for the better." Tears threatened again, and this time she couldn't hold them back. "And if the people reject me? If they agree with the nobles that an orphan should never be queen?" His thumbs brushed her knuckles, the gesture oddly tender amid such momentous discussion. "Then we will know the kingdom is not yet ready for the changes I envision. But I suspect." His eyes held hers steadily. "You underestimate how many quietly hope for a world where birth does not determine destiny." The assembly was arranged with breathtaking speed. 3 days later, Ellen stood beside the king on a specially constructed platform in the great market square of the capital city. Unlike the hasty wooden structure of her accusation, this platform rose imposingly, draped in royal colors, visible from every corner of the massive gathering place. And gather they did. Thousands of people, more than Ellen had ever seen in one place, packed the square and spilled into surrounding streets. Guild representatives wore their ceremonial clothes, farmers clutched caps in weathered hands, merchants stood alongside the servants who maintained their homes. Women, rarely included in matters of governance, formed a substantial portion of the crowd, their curious faces upturned toward the platform. The nobles stood apart, cordoned in a special section near the platform, their expressions ranging from outrage to calculating assessment. Bishop Thornwall had refused to attend, declaring the entire proceeding an abomination against natural order. Lord Chancellor Blackwood, however, watched with narrowed eyes that missed nothing. "People of the realm," the king's voice carried across the hushed crowd, "I stand before you today to propose something unprecedented. A decision that affects not just the monarchy, but the future of our shared kingdom." He explained his intention to marry Ellen, the opposition of the nobility, and his proposal that the people themselves would decide whether a woman of common birth could become their queen. "For too long," he continued, "decisions affecting your lives have been made in closed chambers by those who have never known hunger, never labored from dawn to dusk, never feared that a poor harvest might mean starvation for their children." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ellen could see heads nodding, eyes widening, people exchanging glances of surprise and speculation. "I ask you to consider, does noble birth guarantee wisdom? Does common birth preclude it? Should the circumstances of one's arrival in this world determine forever their place within it?" The questions hung in the air, dangerous and exhilarating. From her place beside him, Ellen could see the effect of his words. Hope dawning on weary faces, confusion and consideration replacing automatic deference. "Representatives of each guild and village will cast votes on behalf of their communities," the king explained. "The decision you reach, whatever it may be, I will honor." A shout came from the crowd. "Let her speak! Let us hear the would-be queen!" Others took up the cry until it became a chant, thousands of voices demanding to hear from Ellen herself. The king turned to her, eyebrows raised in question. Panic fluttered in her chest. What could she possibly say to sway this ocean of humanity? With legs that threatened to give way beneath her, Ellen stepped forward. The crowd quieted, faces expectant, curious, some hostile, some hopeful. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such force she wondered if those nearest could hear it. "I have no pretty speeches," she began, her voice surprisingly steady. "No education in rhetoric or statecraft. I was born with nothing, not even a family name." She paused, drawing a deep breath that filled her lungs with the mingled scents of the crowd. Sweat, leather, bread, humanity. "But I know what it means to go hungry so children might eat. I know the ache of hands rubbed raw from labor, the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from working land that belongs to another. I know what it is to be unseen, unheard, unconsidered." The silence deepened. Even the nobles had stopped their whispered commentary, watching her with wary attention. "I cannot promise to transform your lives with a wave of my hand. Queens have power, but not magic. What I can promise is this: I will never forget where I came from. I will never stop seeing you, truly seeing you, as people with hopes and fears and dreams as valid as any nobleman's." A woman near the front, a baker by the flour dusting her clothes, nodded vigorously, tears tracking clean lines down her dusty cheeks. "If you choose to accept me," Ellen continued, her courage growing with each word, Know that you choose more than one orphan girl's elevation. You choose the principle that worth is not determined by birth. That wisdom can come from unexpected sources. That perhaps, just perhaps, a kingdom might be stronger when voices from all its corners are heard. She stepped back, heart thundering in her ears. The king's eyes met hers briefly, pride evident in their depths. Then he turned back to the crowd, explaining how the voting would proceed. Representatives coming forward by region and guild to cast their community's decision. As the first representatives approached the platform, Ellen felt the full weight of the moment descend. Thousands of lives, centuries of tradition, the future of a kingdom, all balanced now on a knife's edge, with her, Ellen of nowhere in particular, somehow at the center of the storm. The crowd began to move, voices rising, some calling support, others shouting opposition. The division Ellen had sensed from the beginning now stood starkly revealed. Those who clung to the comfort of unchanging hierarchy against those who dared imagine a different world. Her hands trembled at her sides as the first vote was cast. The counting lasted until dusk. As shadows lengthened across the great square, torches were lit, their flickering light casting the scene in shades of amber and gold. Ellen stood motionless, her back rigid with tension, as guild representatives approached one after another. Each vote was announced by the royal herald, marks made on a great parchment visible to all. The nobles watched with thinly veiled contempt, certain that common sense would prevail, that the natural order they had defended for generations would reassert itself through the voices of those they considered inferior. The king remained beside Ellen, his presence solid and unwavering. Once, when the vote from the Merchants' Guild came against her, a predictable alliance with nobility that filled her with resigned disappointment, his fingers briefly brushed against hers, a touch so subtle that only she could feel it. Her throat tightened at the gesture, this small kindness amid such monumental events. The Blacksmiths' Guild voted for her, their representative, a mountain of a man with forearms thick as tree trunks, declaring that anyone who knows the heat of the forge understands true strength better than those born to silk. The weavers followed, their spokeswoman tearfully proclaiming that the finest tapestry requires threads of all kinds, even the simplest. Fishermen, carpenters, tanners, farmers, the votes accumulated, transforming numbers into possibility. Yet opposition remained strong. Wealthy trade guilds, those dependent on noble patronage, and communities led by church-appointed officials cast their votes against her. The tally remained perilously close as the last guild representatives approached. Lord Chancellor Blackwood couldn't contain his satisfaction, leaning toward Duke Hargrove with a smirk that spoke volumes. "The common rabble proves more sensible than His Majesty anticipated," he remarked, voice pitched deliberately to carry to the platform. Ellen's stomach clenched. Perhaps this had all been foolish optimism, the belief that centuries of tradition could be overturned by one king's vision and one orphan girl's story. Perhaps the people themselves weren't ready to imagine a world different from the one they'd always known. The final representatives approached, village elders from the outermost farming communities, men and women with earth permanently embedded in the creases of their hands, faces weathered by decades of sun and wind, eyes that had witnessed countless harvests, births, deaths, and struggles. They moved as a group, conferring quietly among themselves before the eldest. A woman so bent with age that she required a gnarled walking stick stepped forward. "We have traveled 3 days to cast this vote," she announced, her voice surprisingly strong for her frail frame. 3 days of listening to our people, to their hopes and fears." The square fell silent, even the restless nobles stilling their whispers. The old woman fixed her gaze directly on Ellen. "Girl," she said, "you spoke of hunger, of working land owned by others, of being unseen." The walking stick tapped against the wooden platform. "Tell me, if you become queen, will you still remember the taste of barley porridge stretched too thin? Will you recall the ache in your shoulders after washing linens from dawn till dusk? Or will palace walls make your memory grow convenient?" Ellen stepped forward, her heart pounding against her ribs. This wasn't a formal part of the proceedings, but she sensed the crucial importance of this unexpected challenge. "I will remember," she said, voice steady despite her trembling hands. not just in my mind, but in my body. These calluses," she held out her upturned palms for all to see, "may fade, but the memory of how they formed remains in my bones." The old woman studied her, eyes sharp despite the cloudy film of age. "And what will you do with these memories when you wear a crown?" "Bear witness," Ellen replied without hesitation. "Ensure that decisions made in gilded chambers account for their impact in fields and workshops and kitchens." Pretty words. The old woman tilted her head. "But words are wind. Actions reveal truth." "Then judge me by my actions when the time comes," Ellen said. "If I forget where I came from, if privilege blinds me to suffering, hold me accountable. Remind me. I would rather hear harsh truths from honest tongues than pleasant lies from those seeking favor." Something shifted in the old woman's expression, skepticism giving way to tentative belief. She turned to her fellow elders, who nodded in silent communication, perfected through decades of shared hardship. "The outer villages," she announced, voice carrying across the hushed square, "cast our votes in favor of the orphan queen. May she remain as straight in palace halls as she stands before us today." The herald's voice rang out with the final tally. The margin was narrow, painfully so, but unmistakable. More had voted for her than against. A commoner would become queen. For one heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the square erupted. Farmers threw caps into the air. Women embraced, tears streaming down weather-worn cheeks. Children too young to understand the political significance sensed the joy and joined in, dancing between adult legs with uninhibited glee. Among the nobles, reactions ranged from shocked disbelief to calculated reassessment. Lord Chancellor Blackwood's face had turned a dangerous shade of purple, his knuckles white around the pommel of his ceremonial sword. Lady Pembroke swooned dramatically, requiring 2 attendants to prevent her collapse. Duke Hargrove stood frozen, jaw working silently, as if chewing on words too bitter to swallow. The king turned to Ellen, public decorum forgotten as he took both her hands in his. Tears shone in his eyes, catching the torchlight. "They chose you," he said, voice thick with emotion. "They chose hope over fear, possibility over tradition." Ellen could barely breathe through the tightness in her chest. "They chose change," she whispered. "A terrifying, beautiful change." Later, historians would mark this day as the beginning of the realm's transformation. The Assembly of Common Voice, initially created for a single decision, would evolve into a permanent institution, giving farmers and artisans unprecedented input into matters of state. The nobility, though wounded in pride, would gradually adapt, some embracing the new order, others retiring to distant estates to nurse their resentment. But in that moment, Ellen knew none of this. She knew only that her life had irrevocably changed, and with it, countless others. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders, both crushing and exhilarating. The coronation occurred 3 weeks later. Ellen stood before the high altar as the crown, redesigned to better fit her smaller frame, was placed upon her head. The cold metal pressed against her temples, simultaneously foreign and strangely fitting. The cathedral echoed with formal declarations and ancient oaths, words that had been spoken for generations, now given new meaning through her unprecedented elevation. Lady Ravenswood watched from the 6th row, her expression a careful mask hiding calculations surely spinning behind her eyes. Her daughters flanked her, Cecily's face tear-stained with thwarted ambition. Lord Ravenswood, ever the pragmatist, had already begun boasting of his critical role in shaping the new queen's character. As Ellen processed through streets lined with cheering citizens, she caught sight of faces from her former life. Cook, weeping openly into her apron. The stablemaster, his hostile glare softened to grudging respect. The young scullery maid who had once slipped her extra bread, now beaming with vicarious pride. Not all faces showed joy. Pockets of silence punctuated the celebration. Disapproving eyes tracking her carriage, mouths set in hard lines of rejection. The bishop himself had refused to place the crown upon her head, requiring the archbishop to be summoned from a distant province. Change, Ellen realized, would not come easily or completely, even with royal mandate. The early months of her reign confirmed this truth. Court ladies whispered behind fans when she entered rooms, conversations dying abruptly. Servants studied her with wary curiosity, unsure how to treat a queen who had once been one of them. Diplomatic receptions became exercises in subtle humiliation, foreign dignitaries often addressing their comments to the king while pointedly ignoring his common-born wife. Yet Ellen persisted. She established a weekly audience where any citizen, noble or common, might bring concerns directly to the crown. She insisted on visiting orphanages, workhouses, and prisons, places royalty had traditionally ignored. When winter brought famine to northern provinces, she personally supervised the distribution of royal grain reserves, remembering all too well the gnawing emptiness of prolonged hunger. "You need not personally inspect every granary," the king said gently, finding her exhausted over inventory scrolls one night. "That's why we have ministers." "Ministers don't know the difference between hunger and starvation," she replied, rubbing her tired eyes. "I do." On the anniversary of her coronation, Ellen returned to Westmere, the town where she had once stood accused of witchcraft. The royal procession moved through streets transformed by a year of policy changes. New guild halls stood where derelict buildings had crumbled. A school accepted children regardless of parentage. A hospital treated ailments once left to fester due to poverty. In the town square, the very place where she had faced public humiliation, Ellen descended from her carriage without assistance. The elaborate court dress felt cumbersome compared to the simple clothes she had once worn, but she moved with a grace born of practice rather than birth. The old woman who had delivered the deciding vote waited at the edge of the crowd, still leaning on her gnarled walking stick. Ellen approached her directly, ignoring protocols that would have kept Queen separate from commoner. "You asked if I would remember," she said quietly, for the old woman's ears alone. "I have not forgotten." The woman studied her, eyes sharp despite another year's passing. "The crown weighs heavy," she observed, noting the subtle tension in Ellen's posture. "Heavier than laundry baskets, I'd wager." "Different weight," Ellen admitted, "but yes, heavy in its way." "And your heart? Has it hardened with power?" Instead of answering immediately, Ellen reached into a hidden pocket of her royal gown. She withdrew a small object, a smooth river stone, unremarkable except for a natural pattern that resembled a bird in flight. She placed it in the old woman's weathered palm. "I collected stones as a child," she explained. "Beautiful things that cost nothing, that no one could take away. This one stayed beneath my pillow at Ravenswood Manor for 10 years. Her voice softened. "It reminds me that beauty exists everywhere, even in places others consider worthless." The old woman's fingers closed around the stone, her eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears. "You'll do," she said gruffly. "You'll do just fine." Not a fairy tale ending. Not quite. There would always be those who resented her elevation, who whispered that her blood was too common for the crown she wore. There would be crises requiring difficult decisions, compromises that satisfied no one entirely. The path she and the king had chosen would never be easy. But as Ellen looked across the square, at faces upturned with tentative hope where once there had been only resignation, she knew with bone-deep certainty the struggle was worth every moment. True nobility had nothing to do with bloodlines or ancient names. It lived in the courage to remain authentic when falseness would be easier, to remember one's origins when amnesia would be convenient, to stand firm when bending would bring comfort. She had been Ellen of nowhere in particular. Now she was a queen who carried that nowhere in her heart, transforming it into a beacon for all who dared believe that birth need not determine destiny. What would you do if the world suddenly saw you, truly saw you, after a lifetime of invisibility? Would you have Ellen's courage to speak truth before power, to stand firm when threatened, to believe yourself worthy of a place at the table? Her journey reminds us that the most powerful change often begins with a single moment of recognition, someone seeing value where others saw nothing. The truest measure of nobility has never been found in bloodlines or titles, but in the courage to remain authentic when the world demands you shrink yourself to fit its expectations. Like Ellen, each of us faces moments where we must choose between comfortable invisibility and the dangerous path of standing in our full truth. Perhaps her story calls us to recognize the unseen around us, to question the hierarchies we've accepted as natural, and to believe that a better world is possible when we dare to imagine it. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own worth. Follow for more tales that challenge us to see beyond appearances, and remember, the most revolutionary act can sometimes be simply seeing someone for who they truly are, not what the world has labeled them. Like, share, and join our community of storytellers and dreamers who believe that stories have the power to change how we see ourselves and each other.